Now
Yeah.
with climate change being like, a real concern, like building dams that are reliable in a way that that you can build reliably. Like with climate change in perspective, it's becoming increasingly harder. We are also in an earthquake prone zone, so these are like they bring their own risks. And so like and on top of that, they are also very costly, take a lot of time.
So in a way, you can sort of say it, and you can sort of edit this out, but like it's sort of really petty from India what they're doing, right? Like this is solely designed to create a narrative and sort of create problems for Pakistan without really any benefits for themselves.
The quantity of water is not going to change by India's disruptions. It's the timing of how the water comes. So we have to adapt downstream. On what humanitarian grounds are you standing if you're doing this? You are you're trying to disrupt water for food security of a country downstream.
Hello and welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. Water has always been at the heart of Pakistan's economy, agriculture, and food security. But in recent months, following tensions between India and Pakistan, questions over water security have moved from technical discussions into everyday conversations. Many people began asking, can India really stop Pakistan's water supply? And if not, what are the actual risks that Pakistan should be preparing for? Today, we're discussing these important questions through the lens of science, data, and policy. Joining us are two distinguished experts, Dr. Taimoor Akhtar, environmental data scientist at Microsoft, and Dr. Hassaan Furqan Khan, professor of environmental studies at Tufts University. Together, we'll unpack what the recent changes in the Chenab River actually tell us, examine the strength and limitations of the Indus Waters Treaty, and explore what Pakistan can do to build greater resilience in the face of growing geopolitical and climate related pressures. Hello, Hassan and Taimoor. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for
Hello.
having us.
Thank you for having us.
So, water has always been central to Pakistan's economy, food security, and national security as well. Following the recent tensions, between India and Pakistan, many people, they've become concerned that India could simply, just stop Pakistan's water supply. How accurate is that perception? And I'd just like you guys to talk about what is the reality behind this.
To keep it very simple, sort of the short answer is India cannot simply just stop the water flowing into Pakistan. The rivers that flow through India into Pakistan are huge rivers with a lot of water flowing through them. And there simply isn't any infrastructure that can allow India to stop the flow of water completely on any of these rivers for any amount of time. And so the short answer is that India cannot simply just stop the flow of water. I think more interesting question, or the more interesting challenge that's relevant in this case is disruptions in flow. So there's a difference between stopping the flow completely and then disrupting the flow, right? And so even when it comes to disrupting the flow, we see that you need significant infrastructure on these rivers to even, sort of substantially interrupt or disrupt the flow. And when it comes to sort of basically the three western rivers that were, allocated to Pakistan as part of the Indus Waters Treaty, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab. When we look at the infrastructure that's available to India to disrupt the flow into Pakistan, on the Indus and the Jhelum, there really is very little infrastructure or storage that India has upstream that can disrupt the flow into Pakistan. And the small infrastructure that India has, whatever disruptions it would create on Indus and Jhelum, Pakistan has, in comparison, significantly large storages, Tarbela and Mangla, that can mitigate any impact of those disruptions. So the Indus and Jhelum, when it comes to even flow disruption, is not a challenge. Where this becomes pertinent and has become pertinent over the past year is Chenab. Flow disruptions in Chenab are something that at least in comparison to Indus and Jhelum, are significantly, sort of more realistic and more possible. And we've seen India, sort of taking actions to create disruptions in flow entering into Pakistan. And in recent months, India has sort of signaled plans to build flow diversions from the Chenab River, which would in fact actually have an impact on the total flows also entering into Pakistan. Right. So I guess the sort of helping the viewers to sort of understand the difference between flow disruptions and completely stopping the flow is really when we talk about completely stopping the flow, it means basically changing how much water enters into Pakistan, right? Like reducing how much water enters into Pakistan. Flow disruption is there is no change in how much water enters into Pakistan. Still, the same amount of water is entering Pakistan, or Pakistan is receiving the same amount of water. It's just that the timing of those flows, when and how that water flows, gets disrupted. And that's a challenge because you want to know when the flow is going to be available so that you can sort of manage your infrastructure accordingly. So hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Absolutely, and I think this is an extremely important, distinction, and I think it helps, separate, the facts that you told us from fear that people often face, when these things happen. And, to better understand why this issue is so significant, I would just like to take, a step back and look at the framework that governs these shared rivers. So before, we get into these recent developments, can one of you, briefly explain how the Indus Water Treaty works and why has it remained so important for both countries for over 60 years?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think as Hassaan just mentioned, the thing about he mentioned Western rivers and Eastern rivers.
Yeah.
So basically essentially if you just have to explain it in a couple of sentences, the Indus Water Treaty is kind of like a geographical split, because as the country is split, it's a split in the river systems. So the entire Indus river system, there are 6 major rivers: Indus, Chenab, Jhelum, Ravi, Satluj, and Beas. And according to the treaty, it was signed in 1960. The western rivers, which are Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum, they were allocated for consumptive use. The thing that Hassaan primarily mentioned, they were assigned to Pakistan for consumptive use, which is that Pakistan can use its water for consumption. Consumptive uses include domestic uses, and in the case of Pakistan or even in India, for the Indus Basin, it's agricultural use. And eastern rivers, which are Satluj, Ravi, and Beas, they are allocated to India for consumptive use, according to the treaty. And there are some caveats in here. For instance, there are some local usages on the western rivers that India is still allowed. And India is also allowed because the complication for Pakistan is that there is none of these rivers, there's no upstream area in these rivers that goes back into India. India is the upstream. India is upstream on all of these rivers. Pakistan is downstream, which means that the rivers flows later in Pakistan before they go into the sea. And one other thing that has been given to India is that they have some rights to develop hydropower projects with again the caveat that they should not all the projects that are built on the western rivers do not in any way disrupt Pakistan's capability of consumptive usage downstream. So the essence of the treaty, the way it was designed is that the split is there. Consumptive usages of the eastern rivers are there for India. Consumptive usages for the western rivers are there for Pakistan. But India has allowed certain liberties on the western rivers, including some minor local consumption and also hydropower. But again, the treaty was designed in a way that the hydropower usage of India does not give them a lot of control and does not give them the right to consume that water in any way or have a right to disrupt it in a way or take it away to consume it. So those are the guidelines around which the treaty was done. And to answer your second question of why it has worked, that is again from research perspective, these things are always debatable. Is that something that worked, or is that something that that is what has happened in other river basins, in such a geopolitical space is this a success or a failure? I think until now, both countries, I mean, until very recently, both countries have not gone into conflict due to water. So if we call that a success, I think the reason might be that this is a split, but there are a lot of like people who call it a divorce of the system. So the divorce of the system has probably made it a bit of a success in a way, if you think it in that way. But it has come with a lot of environmental costs and other costs, and that is debatable. That is it still a success or not? But we have remained mostly conflict averse until very recently, and I mean that is probably a measure of success, and it's because of the strict division. But
Yeah.
like ecologically or environmentally speaking, I'm not sure if that is a success or not.
While we're talking about the division, I'd just like to touch upon the fact that, while the treaty, covers multiple rivers, analysis also showed that all the rivers, they don't face the same level of risks. So one point that really stands out is that not all rivers are, equally vulnerable. So why is the Chenab River in a different position compared to the Indus and Jhelum?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few different factors to consider what makes Chenab especially, sort of important relative to Indus and Jhelum. So there are three things I would sort of highlight. The first is just the flows of the river, how big the river is, right? So that's an important factor. The other important factor is the upstream infrastructure or storage infrastructure that India has on the western rivers. That's the second factor. And then the third is, in comparison, what does Pakistan have downstream on each of these rivers? So if we consider these three factors, right? So let's talk about the Indus. The Indus, out of these three, is the biggest river, which means that the most water flows through. And the bigger the river, the harder it is to, sort of disrupt or change what's happening in the river. So that by its nature, sort of makes Indus different than Jhelum and Chenab. And then when we add to the fact that when we look upstream on the Indus, India has very little storage, sort of almost negligible storage when it comes to relative to the flow of the river. And that's because topographically, just the way the landform is in upstream on the Indus River, it's very difficult to sort of build major infrastructure there. And then the third factor on the Indus, that Pakistan has sort of one of the biggest dams, not just in Pakistan but in the world, the Taibela Dam on the Indus River. And so when you combine these three factors on the Indus, sort of there is really very little to fear for Pakistan, in terms of sort of impacts on flow. To some extent, all of these three factors are relevant for Jhelum as well, right? The Jhelum also has a lot of water flowing through it. India, again, has relatively little storage infrastructure on the Jhelum. And Pakistan, again, has Mangla Dam, which is, again, a major dam with a lot of water storage capacity relative to what India has. And so, again, that sort of safeguards anything on the Jhelum as well. Chenab is different when it comes to all three of these aspects, right? So when it comes to river flow, Chenab is, sort of has lower flow than Indus, right? So it's a smaller river to begin with. When it comes to upstream infrastructure on the Chenab, India has, compared to between Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, India has the most storage capacity on Chenab River. Okay, so that, sort of makes Chenab stand out. And then the kicker in all of these is that on the Chenab is the only river out of these three, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, in Pakistan, where there is no major storage infrastructure. Sort of, we've got Taibela and Mangla on Indus and Jhelum, sort of in comparison, and Chenab, there is no major dam. And so when you sort of combine these three factors on the Chenab, that's what makes Chenab especially vulnerable. And really, sort of when it comes to flow disruptions or changes in flow, this is the one river out of all, when we talk about the Indus Water Treaty as if like all the rivers or sort of everything is going on, it's really about the Chenab when it comes to flow disruption.
Yeah, and I think, the Chenab has also been the center of many, recent discussions as well. While we're on this, I'd actually like to touch on the different events that sparked these concerns in the first place. There have been changes in the Chenab's flow at the end of May, and that attracted a lot of attention. From a technical perspective, what exactly do you think happened during those few days, and what did that data reveal?
Sure. So, sort of it, like Taimoor explained, as part of the Indus Water Treaty, Pakistan has the entire, or like has been allocated the entire consumptive use on the Indus Jhelum. India has some sort of, non-consumptive uses allowed. For example, hydropower, like Taimoor mentioned. So on the infrastructure that India has on the Chenab River upstream, for example, the Baglihar dam, that is primarily there for hydropower purposes, but it does have, sort of a storage of its own. So what happened in the days immediately after sort of the suspension of the treaty and the, sort of the conflict between India and Pakistan was that there's a very sort of a common and an annual exercise that takes place with many of these storage infrastructures, whether in India or Pakistan. Every year, basically, we know that these rivers carry a lot of sediment with them, right?
Yeah.
These, sort of glacier melt-driven rivers, they carry a lot of, sort of sediment within them. And so any storage infrastructure, this sediment builds up in these storage infrastructure. So you imagine any kind of dam, right? Like the water sort of kind of flows through the dam, but the sediment sort of gets trapped. And so there's this practice called reservoir flushing that is sort of a very standard, sort of action that you have to take to just ensure, sort of expand the life of your reservoir. You don't want it to fill up with sediment because then you can't store water in it. So as part of the treaty, as part of the agreement, there was, sort of allowances made for India, for example, on the Chenab for its upstream infrastructure, for it to be able to do reservoir flushing, so that it can carry the sediment with it. And then, sort of you empty out the reservoir, you clean out the sediment sort of gets flushed out. That's why it's called reservoir flushing. And then you sort of close the dam again, and then the water builds up inside the dam. This is what reservoir flushing means. Now, when this happens downstream, you can imagine there'd be some impacts. And I'd sort of break those impacts down into 4 stages, right? For example, for Pakistan, that is directly downstream on the Chenab, the first the first infrastructure that Pakistan has on the Chenab is the Marala Barrage, right? And so this is where Pakistan first sees any impact of changes that India does on the Chenab River. And so what happens downstream when there's reservoir flushing happening is that stage 1 is basically, you can imagine things as normal. Status quo is happening, the river is flowing as it's supposed to be flowing. As soon as the storage upstream, the dam upstream, opens its spillways and sort of, throws out all the water that's inside it, you can imagine downstream in stage 2, what happens is the river all of a sudden sort of spikes. The water in the river spikes because all of a sudden you had the normal flow of the river, and now you've got all this storage that was sort of released from the upstream infrastructure. And so you momentarily, when, sort of on the order of a few hours or a couple of days, you sort of see a huge surge in the flow in the river. That's stage 2, right? So stage 1 is normal flow. Stage 2 is a sudden surge that lasts for a couple of days. Then, like as I mentioned, as part of reservoir flushing, the upstream, sort of infrastructure is now, they're going to close their dam so that they can fill up the dam again because they've let out all the water. And so now in this third stage, when they're kind of filling up their water, you can imagine that the water that was previously just flowing downstream unimpeded is now going to be severely reduced, right? So in Marala, what we're going to see in stage 3 is that we see a huge surge in stage 2, and then all of a sudden we'll see a huge dip in stage 3. And that is basically just however long it takes for the dam upstream to fill. And then once that dam fills up, then the river goes back to normal, which is stage 4, right? So that's kind of like, sort of the order of events that take place. Historically, right, before any of these, sort of major issues came up with the suspension of the treaty or not, This thing happened annually. On the Chenab, this was something that the treaty also allowed for it to happen. And the treaty just said, sure, India can do this as long as, sort of Pakistan gets advance notice, and it's done in a way that sort of minimizes the impact downstream. And what that typically meant was that you would do this in a high flow period.
Yeah.
Sort of the rivers don't have the same amount of water the whole year, right? There's actually 3 or 4 months, April through July or August, where most of the water in the rivers flow. And so the agreement, or sort of the way it's been practiced, is that typically this would be done in a high flow period. Pakistan would get advance notice, and Pakistan would manage accordingly, and really the impact would be minimized. What has changed since the suspension of the treaty are both of these things. India now is not giving Pakistan advance notice. So we find out, essentially, we wake up one fine morning and we see the river surging at Marala. And then all of a sudden we see the rivers kind of sort of, the flow really, sort of decreasing all of a sudden. We can, through those signals, we can tell what's going on upstream, but we haven't gotten advance notification. That's one thing that's different. And the second thing is that previously, while this was only happening in the high flow period, which mitigates the impact on Pakistan, now India is doing it multiple times across a year, not just once. And it's doing it especially in the low flow periods, which really, sort of maximizes the disruptions that Pakistan experiences downstream.
So, reservoir flushing and filling, from what I gather, are part of, normal dam operations.
Correct.
So if similar actions, were to taken place during the winter months also, like you mentioned that now India is not doing it annually. At first it was doing it annually, right? Now it's not doing it annually. Do you think that if these similar actions were to take place during the winter months, when river flows are, naturally much lower, what kind of impact, would Pakistan expect then? Do you think the situation would improve?
Yeah, so I think one thing that just Hassaan mentioned is that like one important thing that Hassaan mentioned, that like while flushing is a process where you can see the surge is like more predictable, maybe, like, because there's a certain amount of water. Like India has a series of dams upstream. So in collection, they have a certain amount of water. So the excess amount that if they will flush, they have like the flushing would happen like at at the same pace. If they flush it, it would be like kind of instantaneous in a way, like a flush works, and like you'll see that surge happen in a couple of days. That was like almost our approximation, which Hassaan mentioned at stage 2. In winter months, the stage 3, which is the stage of when they start to refill again, because like think of the river as like low flow time. The tap is very the tap that's like the source of the natural flow of the water is really low. So then all these series of dams that will fill, they take a long time to fill. And according to our estimates, the worst case scenario is that stage 3 can take up to 2 weeks. And what Pakistan might experience in that is that like like the dramatic change is that like because the tap is almost like so low that at Marala Barrage, where water comes for the first time, the impact is really dramatic, because it feels that the river has gone dry. And that's where the perception that like the water has stopped. So if it happens for a couple of weeks, that's where the perception seems like reality. Although like both scenarios, the scenario that Hassaan explained, when they are flushing and they are filling the dam to the same level again, they're not really changing the amount of water that in total over a longer period of time that comes into Pakistan, but the disruption becomes much longer. So like the disruption in a winter time is the like especially of drying up. It persists for according to our like estimation in the article, is that it can persist for up to 2 weeks, maybe a little more than that, around 10 to 14 days, or maybe somewhere around that. And the other thing is that like it feels like the river has gone dry, and that like has another additional dramatic effect. And in those times, like that water is also super precious, because you are at a certain time in winter, you are in the middle of Rabi season, which is wheat growing season, and like any disruption, there are canals that are linked downstream. So there is an entire ecosystem that actually also gets affected there, but like the perception also is much more dramatic. And although at the end of the day, net sum, there is no loss of water, but like there is this uncertainty which like really really like amplifies itself at that time.
Absolutely. Perception is there, and perception does matter. And I think uncertainty also drives a lot of action that take place during that season then. And while these risks are of course extremely real, it's not that Pakistan isn't without options, right? Much of the public discussion is also, focused on building new dams. I'd really like to touch upon that as well. Um, but in your article also you've highlighted that better water management could make a significant difference, right? So what practical steps do you think that Pakistan could take immediately to become more resilient? Because we don't see the water prices going anywhere in the next many years to come.
One thing about dams, I think this is something that we wrote in the article, maybe like we talked about, Hassaan also talked about it, especially in the case of Chenab. One thing is that it is very hard to, because of the topography that is there in Chenab, it is very hard to build a storage dam with like a lot of capacity. Although there are talks of like there might be some space where it's possible, but like to make the feasibility of it and to make that happen, it takes a long time. And also like we have seen some episodes in more recent times, like not with like large dams, but I think in 2021, like the floods that happened in 2021, 2022 on the Indus, we saw that like there was an episode of a dam breaking. Now
Yeah.
with climate change being like a real like a real concern, like building dams that are reliable in a way that that you can build reliably, like with climate change in perspective, it's becoming increasingly harder. We are also in an earthquake prone zone, so these are like they bring their own risks. And so like and on top of that, they are also very costly, take a lot of time. So that's why like the focus is our perspective in the article is that like there are so many alternative solutions that we can take, and we talked about many of them, but like including like like all of the things we talked about is more about like water accounting. One thing that we talked about, a lot of focus is like on water accounting. You should be able to like measure how much water is coming in at very like specific times so that you can predict things quickly. That's where we mentioned something called telemetry. Telemetry is like an entire system where you are building an observation network on your river, where you are like calculating and observing at very very small time scales how much flow is coming in at different points, so that one, you can assess and predict quickly the thing that we mentioned, that you can assess these changes, either they be natural or they be through disruptions done upstream by India. We can predict them, and then we can take actions downstream. And then that's why one of the solutions we mentioned was telemetry, but a bigger solution, one other solution that we mentioned is the concept of being able to be adaptive in how the water distribution happens later. A lot of people know that like this is a very like I think common thing that everyone who talks about canals in Pakistan, that Pakistan irrigation system is the biggest irrigation system, contiguous irrigation system in the world. It's a very common thing that that like we hear all the time. But more than that, it is a system that is kind of designed on the concept of equity. And because like all of the canals that were developed, like there are like many canals, and there are the water goes into certain canals which are called main canals, then there are other smaller canals which are called distributaries, and water goes into other even smaller like networks called miners, and then it goes into water courses. The entire system itself is also massive, but all these canals were designed on this concept of equity, where like the idea is that because our system was never designed, we don't have abundance of water. It was
Yeah.
always designed on whatever we have, we are able to give to all farmers in an equitable way. That's the way the entire system was designed before even partition, and that's the way the system has continued, and that's the way actually the system can even run. That's the way our system is. I don't think there is any other way we can run the system. So basically the idea of that was like, how will we maintain equity as disruptions increase, both through actions by India and also like through natural uncertainties. So there's this concept within equity called Varabandi, And basically, what Varabandi essentially is that it's like a schedule. Like it happens at different levels. At very close to farmers, like the channels that are really next to the farmers, the Varabandi system is like a trust system where every farmer is given a certain amount of time that they can open, like, there is a water channel going around the farms. They can open their gates, but they're only allowed to open their gates for a certain amount of time, depending on how big their land size is. And like at that level, it's there. But water has to reach the water courses in an equitable way. That there are thousands and thousands of water courses in
Yeah.
Pakistan, and like all should be all should water should flow in all in equitable way to ensure that like the entire system works in a way that even upstream in the system, canals are like switches. They turn off and then turn on, and there's also a time bound on which they are done. So there is a varabandi, or there is like a schedule upstream also. So this upstream schedule was designed for predictability that we had before. Now the unpredictability has increased, and the idea is that like now we need to be equitable with the system. How can there's a lot of research done on this, that how do you maintain equity under uncertainty. And the idea behind is that like as the flows become more uncertain, we are able to measure that uncertainty through telemetry. And then downstream, we're able to adapt and change the schedule, change the delivery schedule so that we remain equitable. And we don't like, someone doesn't like, it's the schedule is that someone gets like one canal is open at a certain time, then another one is open. It shouldn't happen that like one certain canal's like turn is on now in India, and there's a water disruption upstream, and then its turn that never comes, and like it misses its turn of water. That should not happen. So we have to maintain the equity of that system. And also so that is a core thing, because as we discussed earlier, the quantity of water is not going to change by India's disruptions. It's the timing of how the water comes. So we have to adapt downstream so that we adapt our schedules so that everyone's turn still comes in, and that is possible. So that was like a core idea in there, maintaining equity in the system.
Absolutely, but I think maintaining equity, don't you think, is extremely hard in a country like Pakistan as well? Just within the country as well, where we face a lot of governance issues as well. Right now, we're obviously talking about equity between the rivers between India and Pakistan. That's on a much broader level. But I'd really like to hear your opinion, that when it comes to Pakistan, do you think that this Barabandi system can actually work in a manner that equity is actually maintained between different provinces and between farmers in different provinces?
So I guess just to sort of, I want to emphasize between what Taimoor just mentioned. Taimoor described very well, sort of how the Varabandi system works. And, sort of to, sort of simplify our suggestion in the article, what we're saying is basically keep that system, but make it more dynamic, right? So right now what happens is these turns are decided at the start of, sort of your irrigation season. And then kind of like we expect these flows to be the way they are, and sort of we sort of make this schedule and work with it throughout the rest of the year. Though the big suggestion that we're making in our article is to make it more dynamic, right? Be able to be more nimble, be more flexible, adapt to or adjust to any changes that India makes upstream. And with the telemetry system that Taimoor mentioned, you would have hopefully a more sort of more advanced notice that India is not providing, but you can get that through the sort of flow measurements that you already have, and that to a good extent already again exists. So what we're saying isn't something that doesn't exist or isn't something that people or sort of our water managers are aware of. These are sort of fairly standard or sort of common adaptive sort of approaches that exist. Now, to your question about sort of maintaining equity within Pakistan, right? That you sort of asked a very pertinent question of, sort of when we talk about equity, it really sort of depends on what scale we're talking about, right? We often, are from a national discourse perspective, we focus a lot on, sort of equity between countries, right? So our downstream and the upstream neighbor, so India and Pakistan in this case. Within Pakistan, obviously, you can see in Pakistan as well. Within the country, you've got upstream and downstream provinces, right? And so there's equity means different or means very different things, and when it comes within the country, and then within even provinces, right? Across canals, even on the same canal, on the same water course, you've got upstream and downstream, farmers. So your question about, sort of equity being important at all these scales, that's absolutely, definitely important. And, and there's a good argument to be made that, we tend to actually pay very little attention to, the finer levels at the farm level, or even at sort of the water course level. I think your question, if I'm understanding, it's sort of more maybe geared towards the equity that we discuss at the provincial level, right? Like we see sort of these conflicts between provinces. There are power dynamics. There are sort of differences in, sort of allocations, and there seem to be, upstream neighbors, downstream neighbors, for example, Sindh has grievances with maybe Punjab, or Balochistan has grievances with Sindh. And there's this perception that, sort of all provinces are not treated fairly or equitably. And that itself is a very important question. And we've seen in the past year or so, sort of that sort of coming to the fore a lot more. That's something that in a way is, sort of is not dependent or not that affected by Indian action, right? Like the equity or the sort of the water management within the country, or the issues that we have with IRSA and sort of the water accord. That is very important, but it's slightly, or I would say, primarily disconnected from what India does upstream.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So, while we were discussing all of this, a lot of focus was on perception. So my next question is that, beyond the technical and legal dimensions, these incidents, as you and Taimoor both mentioned, that they can also influence public perception and even become a form of psychological pressure. So how important do you think is responsible communication in preventing misinformation and unnecessary panic? Because the water, like you mentioned, the water levels are not going to change. It's just how the things are managed that create panic.
So I'll say a couple of words, and then Taimoor, if you wanted to add on that. Sort of the first thing to understand in all of these, like when we're talking about these flow disruptions, and really it's basically the reservoir flushing that India used to do annually and give Pakistan advance notice of. Now it's doing, multiple times in a year without giving Pakistan advance notice, and sometimes doing it in low flow period, which maximizes the impact. It's important to understand for India, the only, or I would say primarily the only reason that this serves is to create a narrative. Like, sort of from an Indian perspective, reservoir flushing 4 times, 5 times, a dozen times a year is not really, sort of that useful. Once you've sort of done reservoir flushing once a year, sort of the benefit, there are no benefits really as such for India. The only benefit that India,
there probably are financial losses, because they're actually losing hydropower. So it's actually a loss.
So in a way, you can sort of say it, and you can sort of edit this out, but it's sort of really petty from India what they're doing, right? Like, this is solely designed to create a narrative and, sort of create problems for Pakistan without really, any benefits for themselves, or as Taimoor mentioned, sort of actually harming themselves to do that. Now, this is really important for us to understand in Pakistan, right? Like that's the sole purpose that they're trying to sort of achieve. And so the best way of negating that, along with obviously, sort of making sure any disruptions that Pakistan faces or any, sort of impact on agriculture, you take care of that. But the public perception part is as important, right? As we saw last year's conflict, right? There was the actual war being fought, and then there was sort of this war of narratives that was being, sort of fought about what was actually going on. And so in this case, I think it's really important for Pakistan, for audience in Pakistan, and sort of especially sort of journalists in Pakistan to understand is, sort of how we report on stuff, right? So we will, we should now come to expect that multiple times a year, there will be instances when the flow in Chenab just spikes, right? Like this is not something that will be like, oh, and it'll spike and it'll drop immediately. And this is not something that means that India has stopped the flow of water, right? We know sort of exactly what's going on. Water managers in Pakistan know what's going on. There's already plans within sort of water management institutions, right? In IRSA and the irrigation departments and so on, who are sort of already, sort of acting on it. So, sort of the best way to sort of negate the advantages that India is seeking to get is to sort of, more through a, sort of a better understanding of what's going on and a more balanced approach to reporting it. Taimoor, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to add something that, like just to say that, like, I think this is something that Hassan has mentioned once previously when we were having a discussion is that, like, one thing, although like there might be many issues, as you said, governance has been an issue in Pakistan initially, internally, like equity, the thing that I talked about, that's definitely a concern. But in general, like Hassan mentioned this, and I do agree with that, like water managers in Pakistan, there's a big history. And like from an engineering perspective, Pakistan's water managers are actually very, very capable,
Yeah.
and they know the system. It's a very capable bureaucracy that way. So an example of that is that when the disruption in the last May that we wrote about happened, immediately what happened was that, like, Chenab is also connected to Jhelum River, and like Mangla is the reservoir there. So like if there are any like shortages in Chenab, like there are canals, there are link canals, they're called link canals, they connect rivers. And like there is a link canal, there are a couple of link canals from Jhelum that come into Chenab. So immediately what happened is that, like, IRSA was requested by Punjab Irrigation Department that there's a disruption here. And so what they did was that they like released extra water from Mangla, and then they kind of diverted it towards Chenab, so that like the disruption that was caused, that might have like had caused like some kind of like farmers to lose their, like, turn on Varabandi, probably that release was there to ensure that that doesn't happen. So there are mechanisms that guard us against that. So that should like alleviate some public perception in those cases too. And from the winter case, one thing that mentioned is that, like, in winter many canals are closed
Yeah.
for for maintenance also, because canals also have this issue of like sediment being like and then there's something called bhal safai that happens there, like you're cleaning the canals also. So like in winter they do get closed for maintenance. So if disruptions happen in winter, that's an option you can take, that the demand is also lower in winter, you can close certain commands. So you can do certain things even in the worst case scenario. One real danger, though, I will add in here, is that we have one real danger, is that like India might be, but this is not a short term danger, this is a long term danger. I
Yeah.
don't know like how long this whole abeyance of the treaty persists, but like if it persists, like, and if uh if like India continues to do this, one thing that might happen is that they might plan more things, and in the long term they might build more things. There have been some talks about, like, something like a Chenab Beas link canal, like I talked about. You can build a link canal from Jhelum to Chenab. They talk
Yeah.
again, these are mostly like, again, mostly like fear mongering talks, but like I don't even know if that is possible, to build a link between Chenab and Beas. So these are certain things that are real dangers. Or if they continue to build more storages, if they have capability to build more storages, the amount of control they will have, again, they will not be able to stop water, but they will be able to have more control. They can stop it, they can disrupt it for longer in winter times. So like if they build more storages on Chenab, so those are things you can monitor these things through satellite and see like what are building, and then take this internationally. That is the aggressive route that Pakistan should take from an international perspective. That more. This is why Pakistan has also in the past opposed India building more dams on Chenab, especially because when they have more control, when they have more storages, they don't stop the water, but they have the ability to disrupt it for longer, and that is definitely detrimental. Like if it just happens for too long, then it's definitely detrimental. So those are things that we should actually actively pursue, and which does make sense. So I would just add that there are a couple of real dangers in there too, but they can be handled by talking this more internationally. Again, Hassan can talk about this more. We talked about this article. India is harming its own public perception also more. It's harming itself through the hydropower like losses that we talked about, but it's harming its own self. Like on what humanitarian grounds are you standing if you're doing this? You are trying to disrupt water for food security of a country downstream. That is not good public perception globally anywhere. So I don't know what
Absolutely.
gain one can get from that.
Absolutely. And I think that is a humanitarian crisis, and that is an act of war, if you're trying to stop another country's water. So climate change, is expected to, place greater pressure on Pakistan's shared river systems. How do you think Pakistan can respond to these pressures?
Yeah, I think one of the things that these disruptions that we've talked about in Chenab, one thing that they do is that they add a lot of uncertainty, as we explained earlier. That water, like the way this disruption happens, is that suddenly you see a surge of water, and then you suddenly see like the river kind of drying up, and for a certain amount of time. So that is in a way that the river flows become very uncertain. And the way we see it, and that's one thing that while writing the article, that was one of our thoughts, is that when we were talking about like what kind of adaptive measures we take through these disruptions that India is causing on Chenab River, one thing is that there is a lot of this is very synonymous to how we will see river flows, and the way their timing of river flows happen, they change due to climate change. We've already seen like extreme floods, extreme droughts, like we've experienced them in the past few years across all of our rivers, and Indus Basin is especially very vulnerable to this. We have seen that in research. So like although it's not like this is also these events like by India, they are not like they're very disruptive, but they give us an opportunity to like we are going to see like high level of uncertainties in natural river flows due to climate change in future. So like, these added uncertainties should give us like more incentive to make those changes that we talked about, that being more adaptive and being more dynamic in the way we manage, the way we divert these waters later on in the canal systems, and the way we use the water, the way we put it back into the Indus Delta to maintain it, all of those things together, we can be more adaptive about it. And like these disruptions are an opportunity for us in that way, that we should like be very, very fast in the way we become more adaptive in managing our waters downstream. So climate change is, you can see these actions by India to be a little synonymous to how climate change would be. So that would be my take on this.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that is not a distant threat. It's something that we're facing, and it's only going to get worse if we do not take the necessary actions to, put a stop on it. And it can't be stopped, but, just reduce the impacts of climate change. And I'm actually going to stay on this point when right now I end the conversation, that Pakistan is extremely capable. And Pakistan, like you mentioned, that Pakistan is extremely capable water management systems and extremely capable water managers who actually know what's happening, between the rivers. And while we talk about perception, perception is extremely important, especially public perception. And in that manner, Pakistan has actually really outdone itself when it comes to the treaty, because we've always chosen a path that is not detrimental, and that is, extremely not detrimental to India's water flow as well. We've always chosen a peaceful path. Thank you so much, Hassaan, and thank you so much, Taimoor, for your brilliant insights. Thank you so much for clarifying so many myths and clarifying so many facts for our audience, and for actually giving us so much hope when it comes to the Pakistani water system and the treaty as well. Thank you. As we've heard, Pakistan's water security is shaped not only by treaties and infrastructure, but also by sound science, effective water management, regional cooperation, and informed public discourse. While recent events have understandably raised concerns, they also highlight the importance of strengthening resilience rather than reacting to fear. Climate change is expected to place even greater pressure on shared river systems in the years ahead, making evidence-based policymaking and long-term planning even more important than ever. Thank you for watching Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm Mahin Azam Khan. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and take care.